The shotgun blast echoed across the empty plain as Violet Bennett watched the coyote retreat into the scrubland. Her 7-year-old daughter Lucy pressed against her side in the doorway of their weathered cabin. It was August 1878 in the wild Texas territory near Jefferson, and Violet had fired more warning shots in the past month than she cared to count, each one a reminder that she was utterly alone out here with nothing but her determination and a dwindling supply of ammunition between her child and the unforgiving wilderness. "Mama, you scared him good," Lucy said, her voice small, but trying to be brave. Violet lowered the gun, her arms aching from the weight of it, and smoothed her daughter's dark hair with trembling fingers. "Go back inside and finish your breakfast, sweetheart. We have work to do before the heat gets worse." The cabin her late husband had built 3 years ago sat on 20 acres of stubborn land that fought her every attempt at cultivation. Thomas had died 6 months past from fever, leaving Violet at 24 years old with a child, a failing farm, and debts she could barely comprehend. The bank in Jefferson had given her until October to make a payment, but the summer had been brutal and dry, and her small vegetable garden was struggling despite her best efforts. The few chickens she kept were producing less each week, and the cow was getting thin on the sparse grass. She spent that morning hauling water from the creek a quarter-mile away, her shoulders burning with each bucket she carried. Lucy helped as best she could with a smaller pail, her little face red with exertion under her bonnet. By noon, they retreated inside to escape the scorching sun, and Violet tried to calculate their supplies again, her stomach churning as she realized they had perhaps 3 weeks of flour left, maybe less. That afternoon, as she was attempting to repair a broken fence post with wood that was too warped and nails that kept bending, she heard the sound of hooves. Her heart jumped into her throat, and she immediately called for Lucy to get inside. The girl obeyed without question, and Violet grabbed the shotgun from where she had leaned it against the fence, positioning herself between the approaching rider and her home. The man who came into view rode a sturdy bay horse and sat easy in the saddle like someone who had spent more of his life mounted than on foot. He was tall. She could tell even from a distance, with a dark hat pulled low against the sun and dust covering his clothes. As he drew closer, he raised one hand in a peaceful gesture, keeping his other hand visible on the saddle horn. "Madam," he called out when he was close enough to be heard without shouting. "I mean no harm. Just passing through and saw you might be having some trouble with that fence." Violet kept the gun level, studying him. He appeared to be in his late 20s, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days of stubble and eyes that were a startling blue even in the harsh afternoon light. His clothes were worn but clean, and he wore his gun low on his hip, like a man who knew how to use it but wasn't advertising the fact. "I can manage my own fence," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. He nodded slowly, not moving any closer. "I am sure you can, madam, but I have been riding since dawn and could use some water for myself and my horse if you can spare it. I would be happy to fix that fence post in exchange. No other payment necessary." She hesitated. Every instinct Thomas had taught her said to send strangers away, but that fence post had been defeating her for 2 hours, and she could see 3 more that needed work before winter. "Water is from the creek," she said finally. "You can water your horse there. If you can fix the post properly, I have some cornbread I can spare for your trouble." "That is more than fair," he said, and slowly dismounted. "Name is Daniel Parker. Most folks call me Dan." "Mrs. Bennett," Violet replied, not offering her first name. "The creek is that way." She gestured with the gun barrel. Dan led his horse toward the creek, and Violet watched him go before turning to check on Lucy through the window. Her daughter's face was pressed to the glass, eyes wide with curiosity. Violet shook her head slightly, and Lucy stepped back from the window but continued watching. The cowboy returned 20 minutes later, his horse refreshed, and he set to work on the fence without another word. Violet kept her distance but watched as he examined the post, then walked to the tree line and returned with a better piece of wood she had not noticed. He worked efficiently, his movements practiced and sure, and within an hour he had not only fixed the broken post, but reinforced 2 others she had been worried about. "You have got some rot starting in these," he said, straightening and wiping his brow. Might want to replace them before the winter rains come, or they will go down in the first strong wind. I am aware, Violet said stiffly, knowing full well she had no idea how she would manage that task. Dan nodded and did not push. That cornbread smells mighty good if the offer still stands. She went inside and wrapped a generous portion of the morning's baking in a cloth, adding a few strips of dried meat because he had done good work and had not made her feel small for struggling. When she came back out, Lucy had slipped outside and was standing a few feet from the cowboy, staring up at him with undisguised fascination. Lucy Bennett, inside now, Violet said sharply. But Mama, I just wanted to see the horse, Lucy protested. Dan had crouched down to the girl's level, keeping his distance but smiling kindly. She is a fine horse. Her name is Copper on account of her color. Maybe your mama will let you look at her from the fence if you ask nicely. Violet wanted to refuse out of principle, but Lucy turned such hopeful eyes on her that she found herself nodding. From the fence only, and I will be right here. She handed Dan the food package, and he accepted it with a genuine smile that transformed his dusty, tired face into something almost handsome. Much obliged, Mrs. Bennett. Your fence should hold now until you can get proper replacements. Thank you, she said, and meant it. He mounted up, tipped his hat to both of them, and rode off toward the east. Lucy waved until he disappeared from sight, and Violet felt a strange mixture of relief and something else she could not quite name as she watched him go. 3 days later, she found a stack of fence posts leaning against her barn, fresh cut and proper, with no note or explanation. Her nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and she knew old Mr. Hendricks had not left them. It had to have been the cowboy, and she did not know whether to be grateful or irritated that he had come back without announcing himself. The following week, she was in Jefferson buying the few supplies she could afford when she saw him again. He was coming out of the general store as she was going in, and they nearly collided in the doorway. Mrs. Bennett, he said, stepping aside quickly and removing his hat. Good to see you again. Mr. Parker. She nodded, very aware of Lucy clutching her skirt. Thank you for the fence posts. You did not need to do that. Had some extra, and no use for them, he said, which they both knew was a lie. How is your place holding up? Well enough, she said, not wanting to admit that the roof had started leaking in the last rain, or that she had discovered rats in her grain storage. He looked like he wanted to say something more, but just nodded. Good to hear. You take care, madam. She watched him walk away down the dusty street, noting how other people nodded to him in a friendly way that suggested he was known in town. Inside the store, she asked the proprietor casually if he knew Daniel Parker. Dan Parker? Sure, everyone knows Dan. Good man, honest worker. Does cowboy work for various ranches around here. Lost his own family's place a few years back when his parents passed, and the bank took it for debts. He has been working and saving ever since, trying to get enough together to start over. Why do you ask? He helped me with some fence work, Violet said carefully. Just wanted to know if he was trustworthy. The proprietor smiled. Dan is as trustworthy as they come. If he helped you out, you can count on it being honest help with no strings attached. That is just his way. Violet made her purchases and left, her mind turning over this information. A man who had lost everything and was working to rebuild understood her situation in a way most people could not. It made his help feel less like charity and more like simple human decency, which somehow made it easier to accept. 2 weeks passed, and she did not see Dan again, though she found herself thinking about him more often than she cared to admit. The heat continued unrelenting, and her garden was failing despite her constant efforts. She spent long days trying to save what she could, Lucy always nearby, both of them learning to exist in the small spaces between survival and despair. It was Lucy who spotted the rider approaching one evening as they were bringing in the last of the water for the day. Mama, someone is coming. Violet straightened, shading her eyes against the setting sun, and recognized the bay horse and its rider. Dan approached slowly, and this time she did not reach for the gun. Mrs. Bennett, he called as he neared. I apologize for coming by unannounced. I was passing by and noticed your well looks like it might be going dry. I have some experience digging wells deeper if you would like the help. Violet felt her cheeks flush. The well was indeed producing less water each day, another problem she had no solution for. I cannot pay you, Mr. Parker. I appreciate the offer, but I will not take charity. He dismounted and stood a respectful distance away. Not asking for charity, madam. I am asking to help a neighbor. You have got that cornbread recipe that is better than anything I have tasted in years, and if you could spare some teaching on how you make it, I would call that a fair trade for a day's work. It was such an obvious fabrication that she almost smiled despite herself. Mr. Parker, it is just cornbread. There is nothing special about it. Best I ever had, he insisted, his blue eyes holding hers with such sincerity that she felt something shift in her chest. And I have had a lot of cornbread in my time. Lucy tugged on her skirt. Mama, our well is not working good. You said so yesterday. Violet looked down at her daughter, then back at Dan. She was so tired of doing everything alone, of pretending she had answers she did not have. If you are sure, she said quietly, I would be grateful for the help with the well. I am sure, he said, and his smile was warm and genuine. I will come back tomorrow morning if that suits you. I will bring my equipment. He was true to his word, arriving just after dawn with tools and rope. Violet made breakfast while he assessed the well, and when she called him in to eat, he removed his hat and sat at her small table like he belonged there, complimenting the food with such enthusiasm that Lucy giggled. Mr. Parker, you do not have to exaggerate, Violet said, but she felt pleased despite herself. Not exaggerating, madam. When you spend most of your time eating your own cooking on a trail, good food is worth celebrating. He looked at Lucy. Your mama's a fine cook. I bet you are learning all her secrets. Lucy nodded eagerly. Mama's teaching me to make biscuits, but mine do not come out as good yet. Practice makes perfect, Dan said seriously. I bet in a year or two you will be making biscuits as good as hers. He spent that entire day working on the well, and Violet found herself watching him when she should have been focused on her chores. There was something comforting about having another person there, hearing the sounds of work that was not just her own struggle. Lucy was fascinated by everything he did, asking endless questions that he answered with patience and good humor. By evening, the well was producing better, and Dan was covered in dirt and sweat. Violet heated water for him to wash up and insisted he stay for supper, which was simple but filling. As they ate, he told stories about his cowboy work that made Lucy laugh and even drew smiles from Violet. You have got a good place here, Dan said as he prepared to leave, the stars beginning to emerge overhead. Good land, just needs some help to show its potential. It was my husband's dream, Violet said quietly. He saw what it could be. I am just trying to keep it going for Lucy. Dan looked at her in the lamplight, spilling from the cabin door, his expression thoughtful. You are doing more than keeping it going, Mrs. Bennett. You are surviving in hard territory with a child depending on you. That takes strength most people do not have. Something in his words, the respect in his voice, made her throat tight with emotion she had been holding back for months. Thank you, Mr. Parker, for everything. Dan, he said softly, if you are comfortable with that. Violet, she replied after a moment, and yes, I am comfortable with that. He smiled, and even in the dim light she could see the warmth in it. Good night. Violet, I will check back in a few days if that is all right with you. That would be fine, she said, and meant it more than she wanted to examine too closely. Over the following weeks, Dan became a regular presence at the Bennett place, always arriving with some reason that needed attention and always refusing any payment beyond meals and conversation. He fixed the leaking roof, repaired the barn door, and helped her harvest what vegetables had survived the brutal summer. He never tried to take over or tell her how to run her place, but instead asked what she needed and then helped her accomplish it, always treating her like a capable partner rather than a helpless woman. Violet found herself looking forward to his visits, found herself noticing the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled at Lucy's chatter, the gentleness in his hands when he helped with delicate work, the respect he always showed for Thomas's memory when she mentioned her late husband. Lucy adored him, following him around whenever he was there and chattering about him for days after he left. "Mr. Dan is nice," Lucy said one evening, as Violet tucked her into bed. "Do you think he could stay?" "He has his own work, sweetheart," Violet said, smoothing the blanket. "He is just being a good neighbor." "But he likes us," Lucy insisted. "I can tell." Violet kissed her daughter's forehead, not trusting herself to respond. She had noticed, too, the way Dan looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention, the way he lingered over goodbyes, the way he always found another reason to come back. In September, Dan arrived one morning with news. "There is work starting next week at the Harrison Ranch. Big cattle drive preparing. It will take me away for about 3 weeks, maybe a month. I wanted to let you know so you were not wondering if something happened." Violet felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. "Of course. You have your own living to make. We will be fine." He hesitated, turning his hat in his hands. "I made sure old Hendricks knows to check on you while I am gone. And I talked to the sheriff in town, told him you are out here alone. He said he would have his deputy ride by once a week." "You did not have to do that," Violet said, touched despite her automatic resistance to accepting help. "I know," Dan said, his blue eyes steady on hers, "but I wanted to. I want to know you and Lucy are safe while I am gone." There was something in the way he said it, an intensity that made her heart beat faster. "We will miss you," she said before she could stop herself. "Lucy will, I mean. She will miss your stories." "Just Lucy?" he asked softly, taking a step closer. Violet met his eyes, seeing the question there, the hope. "No," she admitted. "Not just Lucy." His smile was like sunrise, transforming his whole face. "I will miss you both too. Every day." He reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she wanted, and gently took her hand. "Violet, when I come back, I would like to talk to you about something, if that is all right." Her hand felt small in his, calloused palm against calloused palm. Two people who knew hard work and harder losses. "Yes," she whispered. "That would be all right." He left the next day, and the weeks that followed felt longer than they should have. Violet went about her work, caring for Lucy and the animals and the land, but she found herself watching the horizon more often than necessary, listening for hoofbeats that did not come. Lucy asked about Dan constantly, and Violet had no good answers beyond reassurances that he would return when his work was done. The deputy did ride by twice, tipping his hat and checking that everything was well. Mr. Hendricks came by once with some eggs to spare, mentioning casually that Dan had asked him to keep an eye out. The attention made her feel both cared for and exposed, as if everyone in the territory now knew that Daniel Parker had a special interest in the Bennett widow and her daughter. 3 weeks stretched into 4, and Violet tried not to worry. Cattle drives were unpredictable, subject to weather and terrain and 100 other variables. But as October arrived with its cooler nights and the bank payment looming ever closer, she felt the weight of her situation pressing down harder than ever. She had been counting on selling some of her vegetables, but the summer had been too harsh and her yield too small. She had maybe half of what she needed for the bank and no clear way to get the rest. She was in the garden pulling up the last of the withered tomato plants, tears of frustration blurring her vision when she heard the familiar sound of hooves. She looked up, wiping her eyes quickly, and saw Dan riding toward her on Copper, and the relief that flooded through her was almost painful in its intensity. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, his eyes scanning the property and then settling on her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Violet, you are back," she said unnecessarily, standing up and brushing dirt from her skirt. "I am back," he confirmed, walking toward her. "I came straight here. Could not wait another day." He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the dust of travel on him, the weariness in his face that went deeper than physical exhaustion. I have been thinking about you every day I was gone, about you and Lucy in this place, about what I want my life to be. Violet's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. Dan, let me say this, he said quickly. I know it has not been even a year since you lost Thomas. I know you probably are not thinking about another man, and I respect that. But I need you to know that I have come to care for you, Violet. For both of you. Not because I think you are helpless or need rescuing, but because you are strong and capable, and you have built something here that matters, and I want to be part of that if you will have me. Lucy came running from the cabin, having spotted him from the window. Mr. Dan, you came back! He crouched down and caught her as she launched herself at him, hugging her tight. Of course I came back. I promised, did I not? I missed you, Lucy said, pulling back to look at his face seriously. Mama missed you too. She watched for you every day. Lucy, Violet said, embarrassed, but Dan was looking at her with such hope that she could not regret her daughter's honesty. Did she? He asked Lucy, but his eyes were on Violet. Every day, Lucy confirmed. She gets sad when you are not here. Dan stood, settling Lucy on his hip like he had done it 1,000 times. Well, I do not want your mama to be sad. What do you think about me being around more? Would that be all right with you? Would you stay for always? Lucy asked, her small face so hopeful it made Violet's chest ache. If your mama would let me, I would like that very much, Dan said softly. And now he was definitely looking at Violet, waiting. Violet felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the frustrated, exhausted tears of earlier. It has only been 6 months, she said, her voice unsteady. People will talk. Let them talk, Dan said. I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Violet. I am asking if I can court you proper, spend time with you and Lucy, help with this place not as a neighbor, but as someone who wants to build a future here with you. If that is too soon, I will wait. I will wait as long as you need. She looked at him, this good man who had shown up in her life when she needed help most and had never once made her feel weak for accepting it. He had treated her with respect and kindness, had been patient with Lucy, had worked alongside her as an equal. And somewhere in the past months, without her quite realizing when it happened, she had started to imagine a future that included him. Thomas would want Lucy to have a good man in her life, she said slowly. He would want me to be happy, not alone forever. She took a breath, feeling like she was stepping off a cliff into unknown space. Yes, Dan, you can court me. I would like that. The smile that broke across his face was brilliant, and he closed the distance between them, Lucy still on his hip, and reached for Violet's hand with his free one. You will not regret this. I promise you, I will do right by you both. I know, she said, and realized she meant it completely. That evening, Dan stayed for supper and told them stories about the cattle drive, making Lucy laugh with tales of stubborn steers and cowboys falling off their horses. After Lucy went to bed, he and Violet sat outside in the cooling night air, talking quietly about practical things like the bank payment and winter preparations, and less practical things like hopes and dreams and what kind of life they wanted to build. I have been saving every cent I can, Dan said, working every job I could get. I have enough now to help with your bank payment and to start buying what we would need to expand this place, make it truly productive. Not as charity, Violet, but as an investment in our future, if you will let me be part of it. Our future, Violet repeated, testing the words. They felt strange and wonderful all at once. I like the sound of that. He reached over and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. I will do this at whatever pace you need. I know you love Thomas, and I am not trying to replace him. But I love you, Violet. I think I have since the first day I saw you standing there with that shotgun, so fierce and determined. You took my breath away. Violet felt her cheeks warm. I was terrified that day. I had no idea what I was doing. You were protecting your daughter and your home. That is exactly what you were supposed to be doing. He lifted her hand and kissed her knuckles gently. And now you do not have to do it alone anymore. They sat there in the darkness, hands linked, talking, and sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence until the night grew late and Dan finally stood to leave. I will be back tomorrow, he said. And the day after that, and the day after that, for as long as you will have me. I will hold you to that, Violet said, smiling up at him. He leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. Good night, Violet. Good night, Dan. She watched him ride away into the darkness, and for the first time since Thomas died, she felt like the future held something other than struggle and loss. The next weeks fell into a pattern that felt both new and natural. Dan came every day unless his work took him elsewhere, and even then he always let her know beforehand and returned as quickly as he could. He helped her make the bank payment, insisting it was a loan she could pay back when the place was producing better, though they both knew he would never actually demand repayment. Together, they began planning improvements for the spring, discussing what crops would do best, whether they should get more chickens or invest in a few pigs. Lucy flourished with Dan's presence, her natural cheerfulness returning in full force. She took to following him everywhere, chattering constantly and asking to help with everything he did. Dan treated her questions and contributions with serious attention, teaching her things and praising her efforts in a way that made the little girl glow with pride. Violet watched the two of them together and felt her heart expanding in ways she had thought might never happen again. She had loved Thomas, loved him deeply, but he had died when Lucy was barely 7, and her daughter needed a father figure. More than that, Violet was discovering feelings for Dan that were different from what she had known before, perhaps deeper because they were built on a foundation of shared hardship and mutual respect. In November, Dan took them both to Jefferson for the Harvest Festival, a day of music and food and community that Lucy had never experienced before. Violet wore her best dress, mended carefully and pressed, and tried not to feel self-conscious as Dan helped her down from the wagon he had borrowed for the occasion, his hand lingering at her waist. "You look beautiful," he said softly, and the way he looked at her made her believe it. They spent the day wandering the festival, Dan buying Lucy a peppermint stick and winning her a small stuffed rabbit at one of the games. Violet noticed the looks they got, the widow Bennett with Daniel Parker, together like a family. Some looks were kind, some speculative, a few disapproving. She tried not to care, focusing instead on Lucy's delighted laughter and the warm presence of Dan at her side. When the dancing started in the evening, Dan asked her formally if she would dance with him. Violet hesitated, knowing this would be a public declaration of their relationship, but then she looked at his hopeful face and decided she did not care what anyone thought. "Yes," she said, "I would love to." He swept her into the dance with surprising grace for a man who spent most of his time on horseback, and Violet found herself laughing as they moved through the steps. "You are a good dancer," she said, surprised. "My mother insisted all her children learn properly," Dan said, smiling down at her. "She said you never knew when it might come in handy." "She was a wise woman," Violet said, thinking of her own mother, gone these many years. "She would have liked you," Dan said seriously. "She always admired strong women who did not back down from hard things." When the dance ended, he kept her hand in his as they walked back to where Lucy was eating cookies with some other children. Mrs. Henderson, one of the more prominent ladies in Jefferson, approached them with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Parker, Mrs. Bennett, how nice to see you both here together." The emphasis on the last word was slight, but unmistakable. "Mrs. Henderson," Violet said politely, "it is a lovely festival." "Indeed. I was just saying to Mr. Henderson that it is so nice to see our community supporting those in need. Mr. Parker, you are doing a very Christian thing, helping the poor widow with her farm." The condescension was barely veiled. Violet felt her cheeks burn, but before she could respond, Dan stepped slightly closer to her side. Mrs. Henderson, I think you misunderstand the situation. I am not helping out of charity. Violet and I are courting, and I am investing in our future together. She has built something remarkable on her land, and I am fortunate that she is allowing me to be part of it. Mrs. Henderson's smile faltered. Oh, I see. Well, that is rather quick, is it not? Life is short, madam, Dan said, his voice still polite but with an edge of steel. When you find something worth holding on to, there is no sense waiting. Now, if you will excuse us, I need to collect my girl and head home. He guided Violet away before the older woman could respond, his hand protective at the small of her back. Lucy ran over, clutching her stuffed rabbit, and Dan scooped her up onto his shoulders. Ready to go home? Yes, Lucy said happily. This was the best day ever. In the wagon on the way back, with Lucy drowsing between them, Violet said quietly, Thank you for what you said to Mrs. Henderson. I meant every word, Dan replied. You are not a charity case, Violet. You are a strong, capable woman who I am proud to be courting. Anyone who suggests otherwise will hear about it from me. My girl? Violet said, a small smile playing at her lips. Is that what Lucy is now? Dan glanced at her, his expression soft in the moonlight. If you and she are all right with that, then yes. I know I am not her father, and I would never try to replace Thomas in her heart. But I love that little girl like she was my own blood, and if you will let me, I want to be the father she needs going forward. Violet felt tears prick her eyes. Thomas would have liked you. He would have been grateful that Lucy had someone like you in her life. I hope so, Dan said quietly, because I intend to be in it for the rest of mine. When they arrived back at the cabin, Dan carried sleeping Lucy inside and laid her gently in her bed while Violet removed the child's shoes and covered her with a blanket. They stood together for a moment, looking down at the sleeping girl, and Violet felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. Outside, Dan pulled Violet into his arms, holding her close under the stars. I love you, he said against her hair. I know I have said it before, but I want you to hear it again. I love you, Violet Bennett, and I want to spend the rest of my life showing you just how much. Violet wrapped her arms around his waist, breathing in the scent of him, leather and hay, and something uniquely Dan. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have for a while now, but I was afraid to admit it, afraid it was too soon, or people would judge, or Thomas would be disappointed in me. Thomas would want you happy, Dan said firmly. Any man who loved you and Lucy would want that for you both. He pulled back slightly to look down at her. Marry me, Violet. Not today or tomorrow if you are not ready, but soon. Let me be your husband and Lucy's father properly. Let us build this life together the way it is meant to be. Violet looked up at him, at this good man who had come into her life when she needed help most and had given it without taking away her dignity or strength. Yes, she said, her voice steady and sure. Yes, I will marry you, Dan. His kiss was everything she had dreamed it might be, tender and passionate and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. We will do this right, he said. A proper wedding with the preacher and witnesses. I want everyone to know that you are my wife and I am proud of it. After the new year, Violet said, give people time to get used to the idea and give us time to prepare. After the new year, Dan agreed. But I am telling everyone we are engaged starting tomorrow. I want you wearing my ring so everyone knows you are spoken for. He pulled a small box from his pocket and Violet gasped. Inside was a simple gold band with a small but beautiful sapphire. It was my grandmother's, Dan explained. The only thing of value my parents left me. I have been carrying it around for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Violet let him slide it onto her finger, marveling at how perfectly it fit. It is beautiful, Dan. I will treasure it. Not as much as I treasure you, he said, and kissed her again. The next months were a whirlwind of preparation and hard work. Dan moved some of his things into the barn, not wanting to compromise Violet's reputation by living in the house before they were wed, though he spent most of his waking hours working on the property. Together they repaired and reinforced everything that needed it, preparing for the winter and planning for the spring planting. Lucy was thrilled about the upcoming wedding, asking endless questions about when Dan would officially be her new papa and if she could call him that. Dan always answered patiently, assuring her that she could call him whatever felt right to her, that he would be honored to be her papa, but she should never feel like she had to forget her first father. My first papa is in heaven, Lucy said seriously one afternoon while helping Dan mend a fence. But you are my papa now, here with us. I think that is how it is supposed to be. Dan had to stop working for a moment, his eyes suspiciously bright. I think you are exactly right, sweetheart. Violet watched from the cabin window, her hand going to the ring on her finger, and felt a happiness so complete it almost frightened her. After months of struggle and fear and loneliness, she had found not just help but love, not just a partner but a family rebuilt and strengthened. Christmas came, and Dan spent it with them, bringing gifts he had carefully selected from his saved wages. A new doll for Lucy, a warm shawl for Violet, and for both of them, the deed to an additional 20 acres adjoining their property that had come up for sale. Our wedding present to ourselves, he explained. Space to grow and build our future. Violet cried when she saw it, overwhelmed by the generosity and the symbol of commitment it represented. Dan, this is too much. It is not enough, he countered, wiping her tears with his thumbs. I want to give you the world, Violet. This is just a start. They were married on January 15th, 1879, in the small church in Jefferson with half the town in attendance. Violet wore a new dress that Dan had insisted on buying, a simple but beautiful blue that matched her eyes, and Lucy stood up with them in a matching smaller version. Dan wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, his kiss was both tender and triumphant. The reception was held at the church hall, with food brought by community members and music played by local musicians. Violet danced with her new husband, her heart so full she thought it might burst, and watched Lucy being spun around by various friendly cowboys who had worked with Dan. Happy? Dan asked as they swayed together. Happier than I ever thought I could be again, Violet answered honestly. Thank you for being patient with me, for understanding what I needed. Thank you for taking a chance on a wandering cowboy with nothing but determination and a good horse, Dan countered, smiling. You have given me everything I ever wanted. A home, a family, a purpose beyond just surviving. That night, after the celebrations ended, and they returned to their cabin with Lucy asleep in the wagon between them, Dan carried his new daughter inside and tucked her in while Violet lit the lamps. When he came back to the main room, he took Violet's hands in his. Mrs. Parker, he said, savoring the name. I like the sound of that. So do I, Violet said, and meant it with everything in her. She was no longer Violet Bennett, alone and struggling. She was Violet Parker, with a husband who loved her, and a future that looked bright. They stood together in the lamplight, holding each other close, and Violet sent a silent thank you to Thomas, wherever he was. Thank you for bringing me to this place, for giving me Lucy, for loving us enough that I learned what good love looks like. I will always remember you, but I am not alone anymore, and I know you would want that for us. Dan seemed to understand without words, holding her as she processed the bittersweet emotions of moving fully into this new chapter. We will make sure Lucy always knows about her first father, he said quietly. We will tell her stories so she never forgets him. Thank you, Violet whispered. That means everything to me. The winter passed in a cocoon of domestic happiness. Dan worked various jobs when they came up, but spent most of his time at their place, and Violet marveled at how natural it felt to have him there, to cook for him, to wake up beside him, to plan and dream together. Lucy blossomed with both parents present, her education continuing under Violet's teaching, with Dan adding lessons about animals and land management and all the practical skills he had learned in his years of cowboy work. In March, as they were preparing the fields for spring planting, Violet realized she had missed her monthly courses. She waited another month to be certain, then told Dan one evening after Lucy was in bed. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for: immediate joy followed by concern for her well-being, gentle questions about how she felt, promises to make sure she did not overwork herself. "A baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Violet asked, needing to hear it. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Dan said, pulling her into his lap and cradling her close. "You have given me everything, Violet, everything I ever wanted and things I did not even know to hope for." "We are having a baby," she said, letting herself believe it fully. "Lucy is going to be a big sister." When they told Lucy the next morning, the little girl's reaction was explosive joy. "A baby? A real baby? When? Can I help take care of it? Will it be a brother or a sister?" Dan laughed, fielding her questions with patience. "We will not know if it is a brother or sister until the baby arrives, probably sometime in the fall. And yes, you can absolutely help take care of your new sibling. You will be the best big sister." The summer of 1879 was hot, but not as brutal as the previous year, and with Dan's help and planning, their crops flourished. They hired a couple of workers for the harvest, young men Dan knew and trusted, and brought in more produce than Violet had thought possible. Dan took it to market in Jefferson and came back with money that seemed like a fortune compared to what Violet had been scraping by on before. "We are going to make it," she said that evening, looking at the accounting books where their finances were finally showing more income than outflow. "Really make it?" "We were always going to make it," Dan said, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his hands on her growing belly. "But yes, now we are going to thrive." In October, with the leaves turning gold and red and the air cooling, Violet went into labor. Dan sent one of their workers racing for the midwife while he stayed with Violet, holding her hand and wiping her forehead and trying not to look as terrified as he felt. Lucy was sent to stay with the Hendricks family, much to her dismay, but Violet did not want her daughter frightened by the sounds of childbirth. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Dan thought he might lose his mind from helplessness, but finally, as the sun was setting, their son entered the world with a strong, healthy cry. The midwife cleaned him up and placed him in Violet's arms, and Dan looked down at his wife and new child with tears streaming down his face. "We have a son," Violet said, exhausted but glowing. "Dan, we have a son. He is perfect," Dan said, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. "You are perfect. I love you so much, Violet." They named him Thomas Daniel Parker, honoring both the past and the present. And when Lucy came home the next day and met her baby brother, her careful gentleness and instant devotion made both parents tear up all over again. "He is so small," Lucy whispered, looking at the baby with wide eyes. "I will protect him always." "I know you will," Violet said, watching her daughter stroke the baby's cheek with one careful finger. "You are going to be a wonderful big sister." The years that followed were not without challenges. There were hard winters and dry summers, sick animals and crop failures, injuries and illnesses that tested their strength. But through it all, Dan and Violet faced everything together, partners in every sense of the word. Dan never tried to take over or make Violet feel less capable. Instead, he worked alongside her, asked her opinion on every decision, made sure she knew her voice mattered as much as his. Lucy grew into a capable young woman, educated by her mother and practical-minded like both her parents. She helped with baby Thomas and later with his younger siblings when they came along. A daughter they named Rose in 1881 and another son named James in 1883. The Parker family became well known in Jefferson and the surrounding territory as hardworking, honest people who helped their neighbors and asked for nothing they had not earned. The farm prospered under their joint management, expanding gradually as they saved and invested wisely. They added cattle to their operation, which Dan managed with expertise, and Violet's gardens became famous in Jefferson for their abundance and quality. They hired workers as needed, always treating them fairly and earning loyalty in return. In 1885, when Lucy was 14 and talking about wanting to become a teacher, Dan and Violet sat with her at the kitchen table and told her seriously that they would support whatever path she wanted to take, would help her get the education she needed. You do not have to stay on the farm if that is not your dream, Violet said. We want you to have choices. I know, Lucy said, smiling at them both. And I am grateful, but I think I want to teach here in Jefferson, stay close to family. This is home. Dan reached over and squeezed her hand. You have grown into a remarkable young woman, Lucy. Your first father would be so proud of you, and I am proud to be your papa. You are the best papa anyone could ask for, Lucy said firmly. You and Mama built something amazing together, and I want that kind of partnership when I am grown. Someone who respects me and works with me, not someone who just wants to be in charge. Violet and Dan exchanged a look over their daughter's head, both recognizing that the example they had set of mutual respect and partnership was perhaps their greatest achievement beyond the flourishing farm. Young Thomas grew into a boy who loved the land as much as his parents did, always outside, exploring and helping with the animals. Rose was quieter, but with a sharp intelligence that reminded everyone of Violet, while James was the family jokester, keeping everyone laughing with his antics. One evening in late 1886, after the children were all in bed, Dan and Violet sat on the porch they had built overlooking their expanded property, watching the sunset over land they had worked and nurtured together. Dan's arm was around Violet's shoulders, her head resting against his chest, both of them content in the peaceful silence. Do you ever think about that first day? Dan asked, when you met me with a shotgun and looked like you wanted to shoot me? Violet laughed softly. I was terrified. You could have been anyone, and there I was, alone with Lucy depending on me. You were magnificent, Dan said, fierce and brave and so determined. I fell in love with you right then, though I did not admit it to myself for a while. When did you admit it? Violet asked, curious. The day I came back with those fence posts and left them without announcing myself. I rode away and realized I was thinking about you and Lucy constantly, that I wanted to be part of your lives in a permanent way. That is when I knew I was in love. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. Best decision I ever made, staying in Jefferson that summer instead of moving on to the next job. Best thing that ever happened to me was you showing up when you did, Violet said. I was drowning, Dan. I would not have made it through that winter without help, and I was too proud to ask for it. You gave me help without making me feel weak, and that changed everything. We saved each other, Dan said. I was drifting before I met you, just working and saving with no real direction. You and Lucy gave me purpose, gave me a reason to build instead of just survive. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. Their life together had not been easy, but it had been good, built on foundations of respect and partnership and genuine love. Violet thought about the woman she had been 8 years ago, alone and struggling and afraid, and marveled at the transformation. She was still strong, still capable, but now she had someone to share the burden and the joy. Thank you for not taking over, Violet said suddenly, for always treating me like an equal partner instead of someone who needed to be managed. Dan tightened his arm around her. That is the only way I know how to love you, Violet. You are the strongest person I know. The thought of trying to control or diminish that would be like trying to control the wind. Pointless and wrong. I love you, Dan Parker, Violet said, turning to look up at him in the gathering darkness. More than I can ever adequately express. I love you too, Violet Parker, he replied, and kissed her with the same tenderness and passion he had shown on their wedding day, years falling away until they were just two people who had found each other against the odds and built something beautiful. Over the years that followed, their family continued to grow and thrive. Lucy did become a teacher, opening a small school in Jefferson where she educated children of all backgrounds with the same patience and thoroughness her mother had shown her. She eventually married a young lawyer who treated her with the same respect Dan showed Violet, and they started their own family while staying close to the Parker Ranch. Thomas took over more and more of the ranch operations as he grew, working alongside Dan and showing a natural talent for animal husbandry. Rose surprised everyone by developing a passion for mechanics and engineering, skills that proved invaluable as new agricultural equipment became available. James eventually became a veterinarian, studying in San Antonio but returning to Jefferson to practice, keeping the family and community animals healthy. Dan and Violet watched their children grow and succeed, proud of each one's individual path while grateful that they all chose to stay connected to the land and the family. The Parker Ranch became one of the most successful in the region, known for quality stock and fair dealing. In 1895, on their 16th wedding anniversary, Dan surprised Violet with a trip back to the church where they had married. "I wanted to stand in the same place and renew my vows to you," he explained. "Tell you again in front of God and anyone who wants to listen that you are the love of my life." Violet cried happy tears as they stood before the same preacher, now considerably older, and repeated vows that meant even more after 16 years of living them out. Their children and grandchildren, Lucy had given them two by then, filled the pews, along with friends and community members who had watched their love story unfold over nearly 2 decades. "I promise to continue respecting you as my equal partner," Dan said, holding both her hands, "to never take over or diminish your strength, but to stand beside you as we face whatever comes." "I promise to continue trusting you with my heart," Violet replied, tears streaming down her face. "To build this life with you as a true partnership, raising our family and tending our land together." The years continued to pass, bringing the inevitable challenges of aging and loss. Old Mr. Hendricks passed away, and they attended his funeral with genuine grief for the neighbor who had checked on Violet when Dan first asked him to. Dan's joints started aching in cold weather, legacy of years of hard cowboy work, and Violet developed a slight stoop from decades of farm labor. But they faced each new stage together, adjusting and adapting as they always had. In 1903, as they were preparing to celebrate their 24th anniversary, Violet and Dan took a rare day away from the ranch to ride out to the old cabin where she had raised Lucy alone for those terrible months after Thomas's death. The structure was still standing, maintained now as a storage building, but the sight of it brought back vivid memories. "I was so alone then," Violet said, standing in the doorway and looking at the small space that had contained her whole world. "So afraid and trying so hard to be brave for Lucy." Dan came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You were brave, the bravest person I have ever known." "I did not feel brave. I felt terrified every single day." She turned in his arms to face him. "And then you showed up, and slowly everything changed. You helped without taking over, supported without smothering, loved without controlling. You gave me back my strength by never suggesting I did not have it." "You always had it," Dan said firmly. "I just gave you space to use it without being alone." They locked up the old cabin and rode back to the main house, the sprawling structure they had built together over the years to accommodate their growing family. That evening, surrounded by their children and grandchildren for the anniversary celebration, Violet looked around the table and felt overwhelming gratitude for the life they had built. Lucy proposed a toast, standing with her wine glass raised. "To my mama and papa, who showed all of us what true partnership looks like. Mama, you taught me that being strong does not mean being alone, and that accepting help does not make you weak. Papa, you taught me that real strength in a man is measured by how he treats the woman he loves, whether he lifts her up or tries to keep her down. You both gave us the greatest gift, an example of love based on mutual respect and equality. Happy anniversary." Everyone raised their glasses, and Violet and Dan looked at each other across the table, eyes shining with happy tears. "We did well," Dan said softly, just for her. We did, Violet agreed. Better than I ever imagined possible. As the celebration continued around them, Violet thought back to that August day in 1878 when she had stood with a shotgun, alone and desperate, and a cowboy had ridden into her life. She had been raising her daughter alone in wild territory, fighting to survive each day. Dan had helped without taking over, had given her what she needed while respecting her capability and strength. Together, they had built not just a successful ranch, but a family, a legacy, a love story that would be told by their descendants for generations. The Wild West was settling now, becoming less wild and more civilized with each passing year. But the Parker Ranch stood as a testament to what could be built when two strong people chose to work together as equals, when help was given and received with grace, when love was based on respect rather than control. In 1908, as Dan and Violet approached their 70th years, they finally began to truly slow down, turning over most of the ranch operations to Thomas, while they spent their days in rocking chairs on that same porch they had built decades earlier. Their hands, gnarled now with age and hard work, remained linked as they watched the sun set over the land they had nurtured together. "Any regrets?" Dan asked one evening, a question that had become something of a ritual between them. "Not a single one," Violet replied, as she always did. "You? Only that we do not have another 50 years ahead of us," Dan said, squeezing her hand. "But I am grateful for every day we have had." "Me too," Violet said softly. "Me too." They sat in peaceful silence as the stars began to appear. Two people who had found each other when they both needed it most and had built a love that lasted. The wild territory that had once seemed so dangerous and unforgiving had become home, made tame not by guns or force, but by hard work and dedication and the steady application of partnership and love. Lucy, now a grandmother herself, came out to check on them as the evening grew cool. "Come inside, Mama, Papa. It is getting chilly." "In a minute, sweetheart," Violet said, not ready to leave the peaceful evening just yet. Lucy smiled and went back inside, used to her parents' habit of sitting out until the last possible moment. Inside, the house was full of life and laughter. 3 generations of Parkers gathered for Sunday supper, as they did every week. The family that Violet and Dan had built together, the legacy of their love and partnership. "We did good, did we not?" Dan said, echoing Lucy's earlier words from years ago. "We did better than good," Violet replied. "We did magnificently." As they finally rose to go inside, moving slowly with age but still steady, Dan kept his arm around Violet's waist, and she leaned into his strength as she had for 30 years. The story that had begun with a frightened widow and a helpful cowboy had become something neither of them could have predicted, a partnership that had transformed wild territory into fertile land, desperation into prosperity, loneliness into love. Inside, surrounded by the family they had built together, Violet and Dan settled into their chairs at the head of the table. Grace was said, thanking God for the food and the family and the blessings of a life well lived together. As the meal began and conversation flowed around them, Violet caught Dan's eye and smiled, and he winked back at her, the same spark of love and mischief she had fallen for all those years ago. Their story was not one of dramatic rescue or a man saving a helpless woman. It was better than that. It was the story of two capable people who chose to face life as partners, who built something together that neither could have built alone, who loved with respect and equality and unwavering commitment. It was the story of how she was raising her daughter alone in wild territory until a cowboy helped without taking over, and how that help became partnership, and partnership became love, and love became a legacy that would endure for generations. As the evening wound down and family members began to depart, calling out goodbyes and promises to return next week, Violet and Dan stood at the door seeing them off. When the last wagon had rolled away and the house was quiet again, they made their slow way to their bedroom, helping each other as they always had. "Another good day," Dan said as they settled into bed, Violet's head on his shoulder as it had been for 30 years. Every day with you is a good day, Violet replied, meaning it absolutely. They fell asleep that way, two people who had faced the Wild West together and won, not through domination, but through partnership, not by one saving the other, but by both choosing to build something beautiful together. Their love had transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone who came after them, proving that the strongest foundations were built on mutual respect, that the greatest love stories were those of equals choosing each other every single day. The Parker Ranch would continue for generations, passed down through the family they had built together, and every Parker child would grow up hearing the story of how it started, how Grandma Violet was raising Aunt Lucy alone in wild territory, struggling to survive, until Grandpa Dan came along and helped without taking over, how they fell in love while building a life together as true partners, how their love, based on respect and equality, had created everything the family now enjoyed. It was a story worth telling, a love worth celebrating, a partnership worth emulating. And as Dan and Violet Parker slept peacefully in the house they had built together, on the land they had nurtured together, surrounded by the family they had raised together, their story stood as a testament to what was possible when two strong people chose to work side by side rather than one trying to lead while the other followed. They had taken wild territory and made it bloom. They had taken struggle and turned it into prosperity. They had taken loneliness and transformed it into a love that would echo through generations. And they had done it all together, as partners, as equals, as two people who understood that the best help is that which empowers rather than diminishes, that supports rather than controls, that strengthens rather than weakens. Their story was complete, their ending happy, their legacy secure. And in the quiet of that night, in the house filled with memories of a life well lived and a love well tended, Violet and Dan Parker rested easy, knowing they had done exactly what they set out to do, built something beautiful together that would last long after they were gone.